Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. I'm the host on this podcast where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today is Rupert Darwall. He's a senior fellow at the RealClearFoundation. Rupert, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Glad to be joining you, Robert.
Now, I didn't warn you, Rupert, but my tradition on this podcast is that guests introduce themselves. So I've given your title, but if you don't mind, imagine you've arrived at, you're in London right now. Imagine you've arrived at a party of some kind, you don't know anyone, and you're given the opportunity to introduce yourself, and you have 45 seconds. Go.
Certainly, Robert. My name is Rupert Darwall. I studied economics and history at Cambridge University in England. After that, I worked in the city in finance, first of all as a stock analyst and then in corporate finance. I then briefly served in the UK Treasury as a special advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Since then, I've been freelance, working as a strategy analyst, and I sort of accidentally got it into global warming and environmentalism, which we can go into later. And I've written two books, The Age of Global Warming and Green Tyranny, and my latest piece of work is a piece on ESG for the RealClearFoundation.
Right, and I want to talk about this capitalism, socialism, and ESG. So, I'll say it. So it sounds like your career's been on a steady downward trend. You're now in journalism. I mean, can you go lower than this, Rupert? I mean,
that's one way of putting it. We're in the ideas business, aren't we?
We are. Well, so let me start by, you mentioned your books, which I want to talk about, The Age of Global Warming and Green Tyranny, and I want to start talking about ESG. But before we talk about your new report, which came out in May, it's called Capitalism, Socialism, and ESG for the RealClearFoundation. What's the most important environmental issue facing the world today, in your view?
I think the most important thing is the environmental movement, which now encompasses the Western world's belief that to save the planet we have to trash the environment. I really think this is if you believe that the problems are global, basically you will sacrifice the local. And actually what matters to people is preserving local habitats, local amenities, beautiful views, the preservation, the conservation movements of the early 20th century, which have got completely lost in this messianic desire to save the planet. So that, to my mind, is the biggest issue. I think it's actually the crisis of environmentalism, because it's really lost sight of what it's about, or should be about, in my view.
You stated that very well. And in fact, I woke in the middle of the night the other night and I jotted something down. It reminds me of this idea of, it's a meme or an idea that came out during the Vietnam War, and it's been variously debunked and so on, but we have to destroy the village in order to save it. And that's what I see. I've written a lot about land use battles, and it frankly just torques me up like very few other issues, but it's exactly what you're saying. Oh, well, to save the climate, we have to destroy the natural environment. Oh, and bats and birds. Oh, well, they're going to get hurt anyway. So we'll just never mind. But I really, that does speak to me. I think you said it very well. Say it one more time, that the idea that we have to save the environment, we have to destroy it. How did you put it exactly?
It's when you elevate the global above the local. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's when you have these global concerns, and it sort of started happening in the late 60s, and where as all part of as the sort of 60s revolt, but the idea and it moved from environmentalism, or it was that moved from conservation to, to preserve these things, we actually have to completely change industrial modern society, because it's modern society that's causing the extinction of animals in Africa and stuff. And when you start thinking like that, you essentially lose the plot. You essentially lose the plot. And it's basically politics. It becomes intensely ideological. I mean, the person who was very good on this was Prince Philip, ironically, the late Prince Philip. He was one of the founders, or he was very involved in the World Wildlife Fund and its foundation. And he was into preservation and conservation. And he then turned against it when it became very much this environmentalist ideological outfit. And he was against, for example, wind power. It's not very well known. His sons all in favor of it, but Prince Philip was against it. So it was an ideology, something conservationism became highly ideological in the late 60s, and it's really taken over. It's the most powerful. Environmentalism is now the most powerful ideology in the Western world, and we just have to accept that. And the first thing is to understand it. I think, Robert, understand what we're dealing with.
And that's a really good point. And I interviewed Michael Schellenberger on the podcast a few weeks ago, and in his book Apocalypse Never, he identifies environmentalism as the dominant religion of the upper middle class elites, or upper class and the elites in the West. And I think that that's true. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that there is a religious fervor about that. But I wanted to follow up on this because you're in London, you're a Brit. Where this conflict between the global and the local is the most obvious, I think, is in the land use battles that you're seeing in the UK over siting of wind farms, siting of transmission cables or transmission lines. You're seeing it in Scotland, Ireland, all over Europe. In fact, am I missing something, or is that what you see?
No, you're not. I mean, there are people who like the sight of regiments of wind turbines across beautiful landscapes. And that, to me, is the subjugation. It's the destruction of nature. But for a lot of people, it's this really curious, upside down, to my mind, sort of aesthetic, really. But in terms of what Mike Schellenberger says, in my view of sort of environmentalism is at the one and the same time, it's more revolutionary than, say, Marxism, because it wants to completely upend the means of production. It wants to destroy the means of production, whereas Marxism or socialism wanted to just change the ownership of the means of production. But this is about destroying or fundamentally changing the means of production in the modern economy. On the other hand, it's very counter-revolutionary because it wants to preserve the existing social hierarchies, which is why the heir to the British throne, Prince Charles, is an environmentalist. It's why you see super rich people being environmentalists. It's actually about preserving the existing social order. So at the one point, it's economically revolutionary. On the other, it's a politically counter-revolutionary because it's about preservation of, and in fact, as Joel Kotkin, I think, very persuasively argues, this is the new feudalism. Right. Which you see, especially in California. It's keeping poor people poor. It's kicking the ladder of opportunity away. It's taking away from less well-off people, middle-class people, blue-collar people, the aspiration of a better tomorrow. So in a way, it's a very in my view, very anti-democratic and very, if you like, counter-revolutionary belief system, because it's about keeping the rich rich.
Well, it's good. I'm glad you mentioned Joel Kotkin. He's been on the podcast. We talked about his book, the coming of the coming of neo-feudalism, and he's reported does some great reporting on the issues in California, and I've followed California as well. But you're right. I mean, all of these policies of decarbonization that are California is clearly leading in that regard. They're all regressive. I mean, in one way or another, whether it's the EV subsidies or the high price of electricity, high price of gasoline, they affect the poor and the middle class more than anyone else. And the elites, and I don't like to use that word, but I think that's the only right word here. Yeah. They're perfectly happy to subsidize and fund the big environmental groups who are pushing these very same policies. And I think that helps lead right into your ESG report. What you published this, why has this book, the report is called Capitalism, Socialism, and ESG. You can find it on RealClearPolitics.com or RealClearEnergy. Why has ESG, which is really being led by the corporate elites, why has this become such a powerful ideology in corporate boardrooms?
I think
is it an ideology? I guess I'm just add that.
It is a sort of, I think it's fair to call it that. It's I mean, Larry Fink is quite open about it. He says this is necessary for a sustainable and inclusive capitalism. So there's a project there, and one can call it an ideology or whatever. But this is it's not fundamentally about finance. It's about something else. And Larry Fink, who's CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest, he manages more funds than any other fund manager in the world. And so this is a political project. Why do they do it? Well, there's there's a sort of not trite answer, but there's always economic self-interest involved, and it's more fees. Basically, the ESG product, you charge a multiple of the cents per dollar under management compared to plain vanilla index tracker EFT. So there's that reason. I think it's also to do with when you've made it, you can appeal to, you then become the philosopher king. You want wealth and power go together. When you've got wealth, you want to have power. And it is about power. This is about ESG, as I hope I analyze in the pamphlet, in the report. It's about a parallel government, a parallel form of governance with its capital in Wall Street. And they want to take societal decisions, which are through proxy votes and so forth. And we see that, the woke capital and the way corporations are taking positions on voting laws in Georgia and so forth, Texas indeed. And so it's about the politicization of business. Business is becoming political. And a lot of the other thing, of course, is you've got state pension funds like CalPERS, CalSTRS, you've got the New York ones, which are inherently political because they're being run by political bosses. So it's politics by other means, I think it's fair to say.
And why is that so dangerous? You underscore this in several points in your report, which I thought was really eye-opening. And I've followed the ESG business for a while, but I think you make a good case that for BlackRock and the fund managers, well, this is a way for them to charge. I mean, you point out it's 11x, a greater fee than, it's 4 cents per $100, I guess, versus 46 cents. You point out at one point in the, but where does this go? I mean, I think this idea, this politicization of business, it goes to your point earlier about the concentration of, it's not just the concentration of economic power, it's the concentration of the decision-making about where the economic power is going to be applied. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think also, if you look at politics, that in a way, the voters have disappointed, you use the word, the elites. And people of a conservative disposition have been very concerned about the growth of the administrative state, which is beyond the reach of democratic politics, although they are appointed by the executive, which is ultimately an elected office. But the point about this is the corporatist state is beyond the reach of any democratic mandate. So it's the lack of accountability is an enormous problem. And if we're looking at the index trackers of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, essentially people put their money into an index tracker because, for very good reasons, that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a broad base of highly diversified portfolio is the best way to invest your money. But what effectively Larry Fink has done is he's taken that and he's stripped your voting rights in those underlying shares and he's taken them to himself. You say, you're the proxies in that stock, you don't vote them, I vote them on my values and on my priorities. That's essentially, that's what ESG does.
And it allows these unaccountable, unelected entities and individuals then to decide what qualifies under their litmus test for okayness, or that passes the litmus test for ESG, whatever that is. But as I've thought about ESG as a metric, it seems to me it's really just about carbon. It's really ESG equals C is my equation. It's just really carbon dioxide seems to be the only thing that they are looking at. Am I missing something? Or is that your view?
They are. I think they are looking at other things. So that you've got the SEC is its carbon disclosures and its boardroom diversity are the two hot topics at the moment. But I think fundamentally you're correct. It's really about carbon dioxide. It's about greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a way of disciplining corporations to align with the Paris Agreement and net zero. And in a way it's a supply side constriction. It's saying that to meet the Paris target, which actually wasn't in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was net zero in the second half of this century, not by mid-century. Not an insignificant point. but it's about, if you like, erecting a carbon blockade, a blockade around the supply side of the American economy to squeeze out carbon intensive businesses. Now, there's a huge flaw in this, which is that unless you also cut demand for hydrocarbons, all that happens is you are displacing production. And to his great credit, Jason Bordoff, who was this top climate expert in the Obama White House, has written a very powerful critique of this in Foreign Policy, which is well worth reading, and makes absolutely this point. You are just merely displacing. I mean, so the production will either go to publicly traded companies which have a more concentrated shareholder base, which might be smaller, they might be where management has a bigger, I mean, after all, Silicon Valley have these dual stock, dual class voting things to protect themselves from shareholders. Can be private equity, but it'll also be state-owned oil companies. So all you're doing is just shifting production around, and you're destroying very important, highly valuable Western oil companies. I mean, it's an appalling thing.
And Bordoff's point was that unless you cut demand, you're not going to have any significant change. You lost me on the Bordoff reference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would go further than him, and I'd say not only is it not sufficient, it's not necessary, because if you cut demand, supply will shrink anyway.
Well, back to BlackRock and Fink. One of the questions I have here is, and I said, the question was, why is Fink doing this? You think how much of it is his ability to play to the crowd, right? And say, well, I'm doing something. And how much of it is that he can make higher fees on the investments that he's taking in? Or is it both? Or can you even distinguish?
I think it's not either or. I think it's just all these things. I think that's a lot of it's personal belief. I don't think he's entirely cynical. I think a lot of this is the first. The Aspen program first talked about climate change in the late 1960s. So you've had this ongoing thing of businessmen should be involved in saving the planet or the environment or whatever, and climate change. It's been going on a very, very long time, and I think they believe it. And the thing, what I disagree with is they are imposing their views on the rest of us, whether we like it or not. And also they are in the business of not having debate on these issues. And we talked earlier about Steve Koonen's book and how there is no debate on climate science, that debate is not allowed. And that's where the science is settled mantra is so. I mean, debate is essential both in science and in politics and in a democracy, and that's what we're losing. That's what we're not having is debate. And I think that goes also with ESG. There's very little debate on ESG. These things become very rapidly part of an unquestionable consensus. And like you are a pariah, there's something morally unworthy of you if you put a question mark over what good people are trying to do.
How dare you be a Philistine here and question what everyone else believes?
Yeah. When you're trying to do good.
Or trying to expand the permissible boundaries of discussion.
Yes. Yes.
And it's interesting because what you've said earlier about this idea of destroying nature, that's the part that to me, I mean, speaking of elites, and it boggles my mind, really, and is deeply disappointing to me to see so many reports being issued, so many reports by elite academic institutions, Stanford, Cal Berkeley, Princeton, saying, oh, well, we can do all this net zero. All we have to do is just cover all these states with a bunch of wind turbines and everything's going to be fine. And it boggles my mind to think, well, did any of these academics who were tenured and making big salaries, did they ever talk to a small town mayor or a small town councilman who, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Britain, in New York, anywhere to say, well, is this okay with you? What do you think about this? And instead, it seems like that agglomeration of power in the media and in the debate is being completely dominated by the urban elites and completely discarding the interests of urban landowners, urban policymakers, or I'm saying rural landowners, et cetera, that they're completely forgotten here, and that this power, this concentration of power, isn't just in the Wall Street institutions; it's in academia as well.
Well, it's that what you described in a way is is the climate industrial complex. It's academics, it's research institutes, it's the NGOs, it's the foundations, it's the media, who are very important enablers. It's the politicians who get the wind power lobby. They're very powerful in DC, and I'm sure you've seen it in Austin when after the whiteout, the blackout, that they're up there telling politicians what they should do.
Well, you beat me to the punch, because I was going to ask you about the climate industrial complex, because you're riffing off of the military industrial complex, the idea. Dwight Eisenhower, I think, coined that term in the 50s. Well, so is the power of the climate industrial complex growing or shrinking? How do you assess its influence?
Oh, I think it's has grown, is growing, and will continue to grow. I was at the Paris Climate Conference, which happened in 2015, and it occurred just days before the Paris Climate Conference. The death was announced of, I just need to look him up again. The death was announced of the presiding genius of it. Maurice Strong died a few days earlier I think he was in Costa Rica, because he was, or was it China? But he'd been basically in exile because he was involved in the Iraq cash for oil scandal, and been skimming that. And there was a very interesting meeting of people who had worked with him at the conference, which I went to. And one of his chief aides said, where at the Stockholm Environment Conference in 1972, he said, "Maurice, what's the policy?" And he said, "The process is the policy." And that made me think, the process is the policy. And this is like rolling a snowball down a hill. It just gets bigger and bigger. The further it rolls down, the bigger it gets. And if you look at the UN climate conference that way, so they get NGO, they bring in the environment ministers, they get NGOs in. Well, they get youth in. Then they get business in. You have a lot of business in. And last year, the last one I went to was in Madrid. They got finance ministers in. So all the finance ministers, and before Glasgow, there's going to be a meeting of finance ministers. So it's this agglomeration. It's like this sticky, big snowball rolling down the hill, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And almost it's less important of what it does, is just the size of it. And it becomes self-sustaining. It's so big, it just has to keep rolling down the hill. I mean, that's my sort of simplistic, but it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
A friend of mine, Chuck Spinney, who has been a longtime critic of the Pentagon and Defense Department spending in the United States, calls it the self-licking ice cream cone.
Yes, yeah. Well, they've got generals and admirals and whatever involved, and that climate change is the biggest national security threat of our age, and that kind of thing. So then you get the national security elite sort of stuck into this.
So why do you care so much, Rupert? I mean, even as I can tell, you care about this deeply, and you've written a couple of books, and you obviously put a great deal of work into your report on capitalism, socialism, and ESG, which is available on Real Clear Politics. Why do you care so much?
Because I think it's because one sort of thinks that I just see things going wrong. You just think, when I say going wrong, and also the lack of truthfulness, I think, the lack of honesty, that we're being, in a sense, we're being taken for a ride. That we're not. The politicians, for example, in arguing for net zero, are not being honest with people and saying, look, if the scientists are right, and there is an if over that, but let's say our generation must make a big sacrifice for later generations. I would respect that, but they don't say that. What they say is, this is This is all about good paying jobs. That's what Joe Biden says. And it's utterly false. It's utterly false. And I think there will be a terrible price to pay when the truth always comes out. Eventually, reality intrudes. So that I think there's a big price internally for our democracy. But I also think there's a geostrategic,
and that loss is just that the truth is being lost in all this. That the
not just lost, it's
renewables,
being suppressed. It's being suppressed because we're not having a debate. When debate is not allowed. I think the other cost is a geostrategic one, if you like, that this is how the West loses to China. If you wanted, if the Chinese Communist Party wanted a script to get to their goal of in 2049 of the 100th anniversary of Mao Zedong's seizure of power in Beijing, of how China to be the most powerful nation in the world, you'd write in global warming and let the West just stick a hose pipe down its throat and turn on the tap, because that's essentially what we're doing. We are destroying our ability to be strong, vibrant economies, and also our elites are so obsessed with global warming as the biggest national security, they're not looking at what the real threats are. Is the real threat climate change, as John Kerry thinks, or is it superpower rivalry from China? Because if you believe it's climate change, you say, well, we've got to do a deal. We've got to keep the Chinese on side.
Well, and the corollary to that, and you make a very impassioned point there, is that this idea that we're going to switch to alternatives, and I've gotten past this idea of calling them green. I've gotten past calling them renewable alternative energies. Well, then you're handing the supply chain strategic advantage to the Chinese on virtually every commodity, from manganese to cobalt to dysprosium, neodymium. I mean, you name it. That the Chinese have moved in and to control essentially all of the critical minerals, with maybe the exception of lithium and copper. And I think lithium, maybe they've got 70% share, something like that. So it's interesting that you talk about this, not just in terms of our interests as investors and as voters, but really as citizens as a superpower, saying, well, we're going to cede our ability to mine hydrocarbons because of climate change, when the Chinese are saying, hey, that's a great idea, go ahead. Is that what it is.
Absolutely it is. I mean, you think within a decade of the United States gaining energy independence through the extraordinary innovations of hydraulic fracturing, and it's basically going to outlaw that. It's just going to phase that out. I mean, when you step back, you think this is a form of insanity doing this, and yet for Wall Street and whatever, and that's the other thing is with Wall Street, of course, BlackRock's got, it's got huge interest. It sees China as a big market. I mean, that's where Silicon Valley, China, the biggest social media market in the world after the United States. You've got all that sort of thing. So it's the pressures to go down this route are very great. But stand back and think this is actually a form. This is how, I don't want to use the word sort of like committing suicide, but it's a way of just weakening your national geostrategic standing in the world, your ability to be the world's strongest power, the most important power, the one that's actually kept the peace since 1945.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that issue about about hydraulic fracturing, because it is amazing when you look back at what's happened in the shale revolution in the United States. The increase in U.S. oil and gas production is greater than the entire energy consumption of India. I mean, the scale of what the United States has done since about 2005, 2008, it's truly staggering, the increase in energy output, and made us far less reliant on Middle East oil, et cetera. We're not going to be a natural gas importer. We're a major gas exporter. And those are strategic issues. And it seems that the Biden administration, and I'm not a partisan. I don't consider myself a Republican or Democrat. It's just that they seem to not care about any of that, because they're their claim is that climate issues trump everything. And it seems to me that really is dangerous, as you say, a purposeful weakening of our own position.
Well, it's like history has stopped. That's what they're saying, is that history up to now has been about rival powers, balance of power, geopolitics. And all of a sudden, it's stopped because saving the planet has made, is not just the most important thing, but all other nations see it as the most important thing. Well, they don't. They don't. It's a particular Western affliction, if you like.
Well, but I saw Boris Johnson at the G7 meeting said something, we're going to build back better in a more, it was hard to parody.
Yeah, he said a more gender neutral, feminine way. I mean,
how could you even satirize that? I mean, it's a self-parody about, oh yeah, we're going to do this in a more feminine way. What does that mean? It's like, I think about, if I get a gallon of fuel for my car, well, it's not male, it's not female, it's not do I care where it came from? Well, I care most about the price and that it's available. That's the thing I really care about. Oh, is it gender neutral? Do I have to call it they? It's just like, there is a certain level of silliness to this that, as you say, is cheapening our debate, our discussion, our identity about where we're going and what we're trying to do. And
also on what is really important. You lose focus on what is really, really important.
Which should be what?
Well, I think it's a strong economy and realizing the world is not full of friendly countries, and therefore you have to look out for yourself and look out for your values and look out for your allies. Putting it very, very simply.
Which has been the way we've done politics for decades, centuries. That you want to try and protect your interests, right? They're permanent interests of countries. No permanent friends. They're permanent interests, right? Yeah. And those permanent interests are increase the health and welfare of your people and protect them from the outside threats, right? I mean, that's the shortest way to put it. No.
That's right. And you kindly mentioned my book, Green Tyranny. And in that, I look at, one of the episodes I looked at is the nuclear winter scare of the mid 1980s, when scientists in America and the anti-nuclear movement and a lot of the NGOs, basically virtually every single player in the climate movement was in the nuclear winter movement. And they were arguing there had to be a nuclear weapons freeze, that the US should quit its arms build-up, so forth. They held a conference in Washington, D.C. It had a direct line link into the Kremlin, where they had someone from the Kremlin, I think he was a health minister or something, Soviet health minister, who was all doing it. And it turned out that the nuclear winter scare had been concocted by the KGB to frighten the West, as a tool to frighten the West, to try and get the Western leadership, which was not just Reagan, it was Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, who all wanted an arms build-up to really to hold the line on the Cold War, and they wanted to undermine that. And what you had was scientists were basically on the wrong side of the Cold War. And Robert, the thing that gets me now is the scientists, if you like, or that scientist way of thinking is the dominant paradigm for looking at the world's problems. And they were so wrong in the past. They were wrong on national security in the mid-80s. In the 1970s, that we had limits to growth. We had that debate. We had scientists in the UK signed a document called a Blueprint for Survival. And it said, unless the measures are made to suppress, basically create a permanent recession, that modern civilization will come to an end within the lifetime of people then living. And that was in 1972. So you have a track record of scientists being wrong on these big, if you like, historic national questions. They've been completely wrong. And what worries me, as you can see, I'm sort of motivated by it, is these people are now running the show. Essentially, this way of thinking is which is why you have Boris Johnson saying those absurd things that, as you say, can't be parodied.
build back gender neutral, build back feminine, build back. It was it was truly remarkable. But there is in these scientists something that I haven't written this yet, but I'm going to, this messianic climatism, that they are the purveyors of the truth. Only they see the future clearly, while we are not seeing it clearly. And the only way forward, to your point, back on to the Club of Rome and the limits to growth, is this idea that we need to be using less and doing less, and that is the stated ideology. I mean, Bill McKibben, who's arguably the most famous environmentalist in America, has said this very thing. We need to quit burning things. We need to quit all combustion, and we need to be using 1/20th of the energy that we're consuming now. Our way forward is to go backward. That is the message that I've heard over and over and again. And in the wake of the February blackout here in Texas, this has become a lot more personal to me and made me see it in a different way. That's it seems to me, when you're even talking about it, that's where you fundamentally get riled up, and that you really do get the bit in your teeth, as we would say in Texas, about this issue that you're seeing a self-inflicted wound. You're seeing this self-inflicted crippling of our system due to this ideology. Is that a fair way to describe what you're seeing?
Yes, and also it's also that that democracy can't be trusted, that you need guardians to, as it were, limit what can be democratically decided and so forth, because
they know they can't pass a carbon tax. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because to avoid a climate catastrophe, various things must happen, and the people and the vulgar plebs can't change their mind about it, or shouldn't have a say on it. I mean, it's very interesting. The Swiss referendum on their climate law just got, so the Swiss had a referendum essentially on the Paris Agreement at the weekend, and it very narrowly lost. So the only vote there's been anywhere, only referendum on the Paris Agreement, the Swiss voted, it was 51-49 against the proposal.
That's interesting. I hadn't followed that. Well, so what about this idea, to return back to your ESG report, and my guest is Rupert Darwall. He's a senior fellow at the RealClearFoundation. He's the author of 2 books, Green Tyranny and The Age of Global Warming, which are available at all fine booksellers. This idea of conscious capitalism, I've had John Mackey on the show, and this idea that business should do well while doing good. How do you respond to that idea? I mean, you've talked about this idea of the weaponization. I'm reading from your ESG report. The weaponization of finance by billionaire climate activists, foundations, and NGOs threatens to end capitalism as we know it by degrading its ability to function as an economic system that generates higher living standards. So I'm going to be asked the question in a provocative way. Should capitalism then have no guardrails? How do we guide capitalism toward ways that do well and do good? Or should that even not be part of the discussion?
Because capitalism in toto is a system that innovates, and is the only one that has been shown to have wave after wave of innovation. And it's that innovation that has raised living standards to incommensurate levels compared to what happened before. And that's ultimately what capitalism, it's not what capitalism is so much, it's what it does that makes it that legitimizes it. Because if you stood back and said, how do you justify capitalism? Well, it's because of the incredible outcomes it's delivered to humanity, in lifting people out of poverty, lengthening our lives, giving us better lives, and so forth. And that is not the conscious intent of a single businessman running a single corporation. That is the effect of the dynamic of competition, of corporations having to innovate to stay in business, otherwise their product lines become obsolete and the CEO loses his job, and you become like Kodak. They have to innovate to survive. So it's the dynamic of capitalism is the thing that is absolutely essential to our standard of living and to the West standing in the world. And the problem with ESG is if businessmen then actually act like politicians, say, well, we're going to do good for communities or whatever, it means that basically they're going to say, well, when we do this, we're going to ask the politicians to protect our businesses from these competitors who aren't so public spirited us. They're going to undercut us, and these good things won't happen. So over time, the competitive dynamic of the economy gets lost because corporations are looking to governments for special favors to protect them and whatever. We're doing what you want, they say to politicians, so give us what we want, which is protection from competitors. So as you lose the dynamic of a competitive marketplace, so capitalism will atrophy. And then it's very difficult to say, well, actually, this is the best system. This is a system that you can justify because it actually does extremely well for people.
So what you're talking about is a friend of mine here in Austin, who's also been on the podcast, Bill Peacock, he doesn't call it crony capitalism, he calls it crony corporatism. Yeah. Right, that there is a corporatism that, what you said there, I looked up just this morning, this idea, you talk a lot about authoritarianism and totalitarianism. In Green Tyranny, you talk about it also in ESG, but it was something that occurred to me that you again were putting in print what I'd thought a lot about, these ideas about climate activism and what's happening here in America, restrictions on the use of natural gas, bans on natural gas. It's limiting people's freedom and to choose the fuels that they want for their own lives. But it led me to look up fascism, which is a way overused term. I mean, just tremendously abused in terms of how often it's thrown around. But in Britannica, it calls it extreme militaristic nationalism, contempt for electoral democracy, and political and cultural liberalism, a belief in natural social hierarchy, and the desire to create a Volksgemeinschaft or people's community in which individual interests, this is the part, would be subordinated to the good of the nation. It seems not exact, but a fair close approximation to what we're seeing with what you're talking about is this subordination of what individuals want, what's good for them, for the greater good, but then down that it seems lies a very slippery slope because of this elevation of the corporate bosses to deciding what's good for us instead of letting us. Am I off track?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think the reason why the climate debate has not been settled, or arguments about climate policy have not been settled, and I don't think November the 3rd last year settled net zero in America, is because the United States has a constitution and a foundation which is fundamentally it's about individual liberty within an ordered constitution or ordered system of laws and so forth. That is very unlike Europe, where Europe is, we don't have that. The climate debate is over. There is no political party which is opposed to the Paris Agreement and opposed to net zero. And you have a far more collectivist, it means you have a far more collectivist mentality, or one that's vulnerable to collectivism. So I think I mentioned Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland is the other country which has got a deep, deep, deep tradition of democracy and referenda and obtaining people's consent for changes. So I think the US and Switzerland are unique in that regard. And that's why I think one can be optimistic, although things in a way on the climate front might look bleak. When you have net zero people running the executive, I think, that you'll have midterm elections next year, another general election 2 years after, and American politics is flux, and there is this fundamental belief in individual rights and also states' rights. How do you impose this stuff on individual states?
I think you make a good point, and it's one that I've been thinking quite a lot about lately, in that my last guest on the podcast was Dave Shriver. He's with the American Public Gas Association. I didn't know it until I talked to him. There are 1,000 small, relatively small natural gas utilities in the United States. Well, there are 2,000 publicly owned electric utilities and 900 cooperatives. How are you going to put all of them out of business? Or are you going to make them all toe to a federal line? I think your point about states' rights and local rights, I think those are very well. I think you're on the right track in seeing how those politics will. The politics of those organizations, their economic and political power will prevent any mass movement to these claims about net zero. So let me ask a question about net zero. Is it even possible that we would go to emit zero CO2 by 2050? Is this even doable?
I think I don't think it is, and I think in a way it's that and not misses the point. But I think by going on about net zero literally, one can miss the point in the corporate world, which is this is about a lot of it is about offsets. So you'll have people like Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England, and he was ran the Canadian Central Bank, and he will say, no, look, net zero is impossible. But the way out for having imposed net zero on corporations, here's your get out of jail card. Only it's the offset, and you've got to pay the middleman for the offset. So what you're doing is creating a huge offset market. And of course, who are the players that are going to benefit from this? Well, it's Wall Street again.
Well, and there's a lot of questions of where these carbon credits, carbon offsets even work. And my first book was on Enron. So, I mean, the idea that we're going to set up some market that's going to be perfect and we're going to solve all this because the market is going to ride to the rescue. What it sounds like to me is that the traders are going to make a lot of money and the individuals are going to get screwed. That's it's just the history of the business. Do you see it the same?
Yeah, exactly right. It's like, so for the efforts for a blue collar worker in agriculture, in the petrochemical sector, or steel, concrete, basically their work will have to pay a toll for a carbon offset. Their work will be taxed, and it will go to. So, a vice chair. There was an article last week in the Financial Times by the vice chair of Bank of America, praising net zero because it's create these carbon offsets, and the offset shouldn't be in the form of planting trees. It should be into funding technological solutions to decarbonize. And it talked about blended finance solutions. Oh, there's a nice idea to run with, isn't it? So you can see exactly where this stuff. You can see the dollar signs also coming. That's where it's heading, Robert.
Well, let's go back to that because I noted that it was last November, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said we need to, here's his exact quote, reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change. Reimagine economic systems. I've heard the same thing from the extreme leaders of the climate activism movement saying that very thing. Naomi Klein, and this whole idea of build back better. Well, it smacks to your earlier points about anti-capitalism, that there is, and you talk about this in ESG as well, that there is a anti-capitalist base for a lot of this rhetoric, and that there in Green Tyranny you talk about some of these same things about the anti-capitalist and even totalitarian roots of some of these ideologies that are being pushed now, including you make the point about the Nazi swastika and solar and the Green Party in Germany, that there's some roots there in this in anti-business and pro. How much is anti-capitalism at work, I guess would be the simplest question, at work in all of this climate activism?
Well, if the IPCC net zero report has a line in there saying net zero offers the opportunity for societal transformation.
And this is IPCC, not IEA.
This is the IPCC.
Oh, okay, right.
This is the IPCC in the net zero report. So that is a clear ideological statement. I think the other thing, I mean, you mentioned Green Tyranny and the Greens, the German Greens and their antecedents, their sort of very unpleasant antecedents in the 1930s and 40s. And one of the big things that we haven't talked about, the Greens came into being, the German Greens came into being in 1980 in Germany in response to mass demonstrations against civil nuclear power. And one of the sort of questions is, which is absolutely right to ask, is, well, you're against fossil fuels, you're against carbon dioxide emissions and so forth. So why are you against nuclear? Because nuclear was the obvious solution. Windmills, wind farms, and solar farms. Crazy idea, crazy stuff. And the reason is very simple, because the German Greens came into being as in opposition to nuclear power, and it was very much it was sort of to do with German culture, German ideas which one can also see in Nazi philosophy, which was very anti-nuclear. And the German Greens have always been more opposed to nuclear power than they have been to greenhouse gases. So that's one of the reasons why we're lumbered with this extraordinary stuff of wind farms. When this stuff took off in 1988 at the Toronto Climate Conference, June 1988, the same month, incidentally, as James Hansen's Senate testimony, the answer was thought to be nuclear power. And quite easy. It's quite feasible to replace coal-fired power stations with nuclear power, but that wasn't, that's hardly happened anywhere. Finland, they've got two, I think, one or two. We're trying to build one in the UK, but they're closing nuclear power stations in the United States. I mean, absolutely terrible thing to do. In my view, to close a nuclear power station before its life expired is just incredibly wasteful. Because once closed, you can't reopen it. It's gone forever.
It is incredible. At the same moment, and in essentially the same time, when the Biden administration is calling climate existential crisis, the Indian Point nuclear power plant was shuttered. And we're looking at the closure of the Byron and Dresden plants in Illinois as well this year. And the combined output of those plants, those three plants before the closure of Indian Point, it's equal to all of the solar and wind production in California, all of it. And yet you're going to shut it down just because, it's nuclear and we don't like it and, we want renewables. Well, wanting renewables and reducing CO2 are not the same thing. They're entirely different goals.
Well, I mean, this is non-rational. There is not a rational explanation for being anti-nuclear. It's to do with culture and ideology.
And where does it go, though? I mean, that's the part that I still puzzle over, is what that in the end goal here is there an end goal? Is there something in the minds of the anti-nuclear climate activists who are pushing this so hard? Do they have an end in mind? And if so, what is it?
I think there's a fracture in the environmental movement. On the one, if in a way it's sort of kind of split in a way into three. They're the Mike Schellenbergers and the eco-modernists who kind of left it all together and look back on it and say there are mistakes there, and in a way they are reinventing environmentalism in I think in a highly intelligent and sympathetic way. But the core of it has split between, if you like, the climate industrial complex crowd, and I'd include McGibbon in that. And on the other hand, you've got Michael Moore, and his movie Planet of the Humans was very, very interesting, because it's basically saying, look, the mainstream environmentalist pro-wind, pro-solar power is actually destructive. Therefore, we've got to retreat to even less. We've got to sort of shrink humankind's footprint even. And then you've got the mainstream, if you like, the corporatist ones. I very much include McGibbon, the Al Gores and whatever in that, which is where it ends, I don't know, but it's about their huge flows of money through it. In my view, it's unsustainable. I mean, there will come a point of reality intruding that it runs out, but it will carry on for the foreseeable future. But the end point, I don't know, Robert. I just know it's not sustainable.
Well, it's interesting you say that about the money, because that's one of the things I've done. As you know, I live here in Texas, and I've written this, that there were $66 billion was spent on solar and wind in Texas in the years before the blackout. $66 billion. And of that, and Bill Peacock, I mentioned Bill earlier, he just issued a report, something like $22 billion of that was was given to big wind and big solar in the form of subsidies. So, I mean, what other business can you get the government to give you a third of all your investment capital? I mean, it's truly remarkable. But to your point, it was immediately after the blackouts, big wind and big solar said, well, don't blame us. Don't blame us. Well, where did follow the money? That's the oldest maxim in politics. And yet somehow they're not to be blamed because they're renewable and we didn't expect them to produce very much. Well, if we didn't expect very much out of them, why are we spending so much money on it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, there's the answer. It's because of the money flow. Ultimately, I'm convinced it's not about the climate. It's about the flow of money. And that's the part that I think you really underscore that in your ESG report.
Yeah, I think it all aggregates. So you can say, look, we're doing the right thing. We're saving the planet. We're doing, there's a climate catastrophe, planetary, saving the planet is the biggest form of moral blackmail you can find, isn't it? And if you're opposed to it, you're saying, well, you're putting the planet at risk. And to your point, what you sort of asked, where does this end? I think one of the reason why people get away with really, we mentioned Boris Johnson, his feminine recovery and building back better and so forth, is that there's no pushback, because there's no give and take, there's no debate. It just means that the rhetoric and the policy solutions get more and more extreme, because if you're sitting around the table, no one's going to push back and say, when someone comes up with the most extreme idea, say, well, that's not practical, it'll cost a lot. Well, it's the planet. It's about saving the planet. There's no
no cost is too high.
And no cost is too, so you can't have pushback, because then you're questioning the whole fundamental basis. If you're questioning the whole basis of the thing, if you're saying, well, hang on, let's moderate this a bit. There is no place for moderation in this debate. And moderation, by that I mean not just moderation in terms of there's one side and there's another and it's moderated, but also moderation in terms of sensible middle of the road pragmatism.
I agree. I think that's a really good point. And it's one of the things about the rhetoric. We were talking about that earlier about, climate catastrophe, climate crisis. This is the most important thing we're ever going to face, and biggest challenge humanity's ever faced. You quote in Green Tyranny, you quote Obama making that very point. Well, then if that's the case, then no cost is too high, right? But you have this extreme rhetoric. At the same time, you're closing nuclear power plants. Well, which is it then? I mean, if this is the key issue, then why isn't the action matching the rhetoric? And that's where I get cynical about it, frankly, because I think, well, then it's really not about climate, it's about the cash. And that becomes the motivating factor here, that the climate discussion becomes the excuse for this allocation of billions, trillions of dollars even. I mean, I was just looking at a report from Carbon Tractor. Oh, well, it's only going to be, $3 trillion. $3 trillion? That is a lot of money. And who's going to pay? And those are the things that I keep coming back to. Who's going to pay? So let me ask that, who ultimately pays for this then? This lack of it, because your work on Green Tyranny, your new report on ESG, it comes with a cost. Who pays?
Well, we do. And the West ultimately pays. And one of the things we still haven't talked about is the developing world, the non-Western world. And you may remember at the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, December 2009, Hillary Clinton put down, she was going to sort it out when she made the promise of 100 billion US a year for climate finance. And that 100 billion is still meant to be there. It hasn't actually materialized, but it's just far too little, because to make good for the developing world, for India, which consumes its per capita, I know you've written a lot about this, India's per capita consumption and production of electricity is about 1/5 of that of China's. And to enable India to have cheap, reliable electricity, they're going to need a trillion. They're not 100 billion across the whole developing world isn't enough, even just for India alone. It's going to have to be trillions, and the money's not there. Even in these inflated times where you have infrastructure bills going through Congress, which have got these eye-watering tickets on them, the inflation of monetary amounts is just, we've talked about the inflation of rhetoric, but it's also the monetary inflation. It's just, there's not going to be enough. The resources, there aren't enough resources to do this.
Well, and I think you're right. It's not just the monetary resource. It's the copper, it's the land, it's the steel, it's the concrete. It's all of these things that are going to be required because of the inherently low power density of renewables compared to the incredibly high power density of nuclear and natural gas. I mean, the IEA has done their own reports on these minerals and the material intensity of these energy technologies. But let's talk about the recent G7 meeting, because I'm glad you brought up the issue of the developing world, because as I see it, and as I wrote in my new book and in my documentary Juice, that really the fundamental inequality in the world today is around electricity and electricity availability. But here's what the G7, the group of 7 states, pledged in their recent meeting, that they would stop new government support for coal plants abroad without carbon capture and storage by the end of this year. They did not provide an end date. I'm quoting from Axios here. Did not provide an end date for their coal use domestically. This could reduce their leverage with China. There's the understatement of the morning.
You kidding? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to undermine their leverage with China because the United States is going to quit coal, and I don't think some of these other are not going to quit coal. But China has built 30 some odd gigawatts of coal-fired capacity in 2020 alone. But it's a long intro to the question that this idea, we're going to prohibit finance of hydrocarbon projects in the developing world because they can't use the same technologies we used. Are we shutting the door after ourselves and saying, no, you may not? Is that the gist of it?
Well, it's at the same time, the G7 says, and President Biden says, we want to compete with China on infrastructure. Okay, you ban fossil fuel hydrocarbon projects in the developing world, and if Western banks are prohibited from financing them, who's going to finance them? Well, Beijing will. So you've absolutely lost the competition, which you said we're going to compete with China on infrastructure, and you just said you've given the game away to the CCP. I mean, it's just stupid. I mean, well, I shouldn't say it's just plain stupid, not thought through. Because they can't see that hydrocarbon energy, they can't accept hydrocarbon energy, the efficiency, the laws of physics and chemistry and economics to do with fossil fuel production and generation.
I completely agree. The contempt for hydrocarbons is really unfathomable in some ways. But then this is the kind of the religiosity around the debate. But this is something that is underway, particularly in Europe. What do you think of the recent? Well, one of the examples of this, I would call it persecution, harassment of the major hydrocarbon companies. What do you make of the Royal Dutch Shell court ruling that it seems to me they're in even a worse place now than ExxonMobil in terms of recent activism against them by well-funded environmental groups? Where do you think where does Royal Dutch Shell, can it work its way out of this? How do they even manage to try and become a company that they're not?
Well, I think it's incredible. That is genuinely existential for Shell. And it's the really bad thing is not so much the climate activists, it's the judicial activists. It's the activists on the bench who made the ruling. And they invoked the European Convention on Human Rights. I think it's Article 8. There's an article which says guarantees the right to family life. And they use that article to say that Shell had to decarbonize its business more rapidly, the right to family life. Now, if that isn't judicial overreach, I can't think of a clearer case of judges essentially usurping the legislative and political functions. Those are decisions that should be taken by elected politicians, but they're not. They're being taken by a court, and that's it, really. Unless Shell will try and appeal it, but it could well lose.
Well, but then where are their allies? If they tried to appeal this or get some governmental support, are they even going to find any support? That's the thing that it seems to me is that they don't, the big hydrocarbon producers, I don't like to call them fossil fuel companies because I think hydrocarbons is more descriptive and less kind of suggestive that they're not being used or they're old somehow. Yeah. But they don't have many friends. I mean, in high places, they don't have many friends on Capitol Hill. They don't have many friends in the European Commission. Where is this? You said it's an existential threat. Is it really that serious for them?
Yeah, I think it is, because the problem with the Dutch is the Dutch government also lost a case, and it's had to increase its commitments to decarbonisation. The German government lost a case in its constitutional court, or a suit was brought by some people who were living on the Baltic, and said their livelihoods were threatened by sea level rise, and they took the German government to court, and it went up to the German Constitutional Court, which ruled in their favour, and it instructed the government to accelerate its decarbonisation program. So you've got, these are two countries, important countries in Western Europe, where the courts are now taking the lead in terms of climate activism. And it's, in a way, it's very easy to blame, that's what I'm inclined to do, is blame climate activists. But the real people in this are judges who've become climate activists. And there's very little that can be done.
Well, so then where does this end up? Because I hear in your voice, Rupert, and your passion for this, and you've obviously been writing quite a lot about it. You care deeply about it, but I get the sense of some very deep frustration and resignation that you think there's not much that can stop it. What can stop it? We need, if you're right, then people who care about liberty, that care about economic development, who care about development in the third world, they should be really, really active now and saying, no, this is craziness. We need to do something. What should people like me be doing?
Well, Robert, exactly what you are doing. I think the fundamental thing is is debate and public understanding. I mean, I think basically the climate activists in Western Europe, the climate activists, to all intents and purposes, have won, and the defeat will only come when it really comes up against reality, and that we find that there might be blackouts, or the costs become too high. I think the situation in the United States is very, very different. So I don't want to sound pessimistic on that. I think there is all to play for in the United States, for reasons I've given, fundamentally because of a belief in liberty and divided government, the states and so forth. And I think the judiciary is of a higher quality than in the Netherlands and Germany and so forth. So I think there is all to play for in the United States. And I should say, I mean, I would add though, but no help coming from the big oil companies. I think they're just items on the menu of the climate activists. But I think it will be from individuals. I think it'll be smaller fracking companies. It will be farmers who realize that net zero basically means that their pasture is going to be given over to biofuels and to forests and to trees and so forth. I think local communities pushing back against wind farms. It's going to be like that in the United States. And then there are elections. There are elections every 2 years. So there's a battle to be fought and won in the United States. I have no doubt about that.
So you're more as a Brit, you're more bullish on the U.S. than you are on Britain.
Yeah, I suppose I am. I think it will. I do think. I think the battle is over here for the time being. That could well change. I mean, it's a bit like Brexit. I mean, for years that there wasn't but something will happen. Something will happen. I can't foresee what, but I think something will happen because reality eventually catches up with you.
Will Sizewell C be built? The nuclear plant you mentioned earlier, will that be built?
I think it will have to be done in a different way from what's being contemplated. I think it will I think it can be built. If the government is desperate for it, it will eventually say, well, we'll just put it on our own balance sheet or create an off-balance sheet vehicle and take all the risks away from the private sector.
It seems they just can't quite make up their mind, or they can't come to a decision on that for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, but if the government really wants it, it's possible to do it because you just say we're going to do it ourselves, essentially, and we're just going to pay the contractors to do it.
Well, and are the land use issues the ones that may be ultimately one of the deciding factors there? Because it seems to me that it's become the binding constraint on a lot of projects here in the United States, particularly New York, California. Is that going to be because you can't expand renewables in the way that are needed as David J.C. Mackay pointed out years ago. I mean, that you, particularly in Britain, you're very land constrained, so you're not going to be able to build out the capacity that would even come close to supplanting hydrocarbons. Is that going to be one of the limiting factors?
There's the offshore dream. That's why they're going offshore with it.
We could call it the offshore wet dream, since it is it is in water. But let me ask you a few other things, Rupert, and you've been kind with your time. You said at the end of your ESG report that this idea of the weaponization of finance, and it constitutes a potentially lethal strategic move, one that would end capitalism as we know it. Is it really that dire, do you think?
Yes, I think it is. The title of the report is a play on the book by Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian-American economist, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, which was written, I think it was in 1944. And in that, Schumpeter foresaw, or he set out a process by which capitalism would over time turn into socialism. And there were two legs to his argument. One was economic, which I don't think is held up. But the other, and the more important, which I think is holding up, is to do with culture and sociology. And that is that, if you like, the cultural elites become ashamed of capitalism and private property, and everything over time becomes socialized. And the argument essentially in my ESG paper is that we are seeing that process, and ESG, if you like, is the mechanism by which that happens. Now, I think it's possible for it to be turned back because, for example, it's possible for people to say, well, I want to invest in index trackers, but I don't like Larry Fink's politics. And therefore, there's, if you like, a consumer reaction. I think that's possible. I think it's also possible that Republicans on the Hill, who are very alive to this, I'm very impressed with people like Senator Toomey, are really on the case. They fully understand what's going on. And so I think there could be political pushback. And if the Senate goes the other way in the midterms, I think these things, but one can see a mechanism by which capitalism becomes, well, you use the words of corporatism, and it can evolve into that and ESG is part of that mechanism. But I think there's everything to play for to stop that happening.
What do you think of the electrify everything movement?
Well, I think what you put in one of your articles, that's great until the electricity system collapses and you find you're left without any power at all. I mean, just in terms of the redundancy, resilience, and the colossal increase in generating capacity. I mean, it's just, you step back and you think this is being pushed for all the wrong reasons. This isn't a sort of evolution of market need or innovation. It's kind of top-down, ideological, pushing smart grids and so forth, which turn out to be ones that you can't keep up when they're really needed.
I like that. Well, what popped in my head when you said there was ideological energy, not market-driven energy. Or yeah, right. That I like that. Let me just step back then from that and just zoom out for a second. So, talking with different philosophers, different people that I know, there's this idea. Well, what's the one thing? So, what's the one thing? When you boil down your recent work in terms of, I mean, if I were going to say, what's the one thing that I want people to understand about energy and power systems, I'd say power density. If you can understand power density, then the rest of this starts to make sense for you. That's kind of would be what I would say is my one thing lately. If you're thinking about what you're writing here on in your book, Green Tyranny, or The Age of Global Warming, or your new Capitalism, Socialism, and ESG report, what's the one thing you want people to take away from your work?
I think it's ultimately about freedom.
Keep going.
Because the net zero project cannot be accomplished within the structure of a constitutional republic where powers are separated and delineated between the three branches of the federal government and between the states, and where individuals have very strongly ascribed rights. That simply cannot happen. So essentially, this is net zero is about societal transformation. It's about political transformation. And for the US to preserve what I think makes it such an incredible and unique and powerful country, because it's fundamentally based on an idea of freedom. For net zero to succeed, it means that conception of the United States really has to be extinguished. So I really do see it. I do see it in terms of fundamentally about freedom.
What are you reading these days?
Actually, I'm Meredith Angwin's book on the grid,
which I have right here. And yes, Meredith is, I just think she hung the moon. I probably sold as many books of hers as I have of mine, and rightly so. She's just a remarkable individual and dedicated to the ideas that she's putting out there, which I think are really quite important and becoming more so, particularly in the wake of the California and Texas blackouts. Anything else you're reading these days?
The last book, one of the last books I read was, it was called Memoirs of a European. And it made me, and it's written by a Jewish Austrian novelist, and it's about the memoirs of growing up in late 19th century Austria and the First World War and the coming of that interwar period and the rise of the Nazis and so forth. And it triggered some thoughts in me, because what struck me was the youth, following the collapse of the Austrian Empire in 1918, 1919, there was this great sort of youth rebellion, youth revolution, which he describes very, because he was a novelist, he describes it in a very compelling way. And it made me think, why are young people not revolted? Why aren't they rebelling against a society? In many ways they've got great things going. You know, it's a very comfortable society. But on the other hand, through COVID, the younger generation have been the generation that have been completely shortchanged and treated in a terribly shabby way, in my view. And why are they accepting? And then the penny dropped, and I asked the question, is climate change a tool of social control? Is this a way of disempowering young people from seeing society as it is and seeing their place in it, and how perhaps they're being, as I say, they've been shafted? And because if you say to young people, climate change is the biggest threat in our world, and it's you who are going to suffer most from it, and we're doing everything to solve it, we're on your side, it actually removes, if you like, the causes for them from staging a revolt. And I also wrote this up, I'll send it to you, I wrote it up for Real Clear and said, is climate change a tool of social control? Why was it in 1968 you had a youth rebellion and so forth? There's nothing now like that. Nothing. I mean, there's Antifa and stuff, but they're small. But why are young people so acquiescent? Well, it's because Greta Thunberg is saying climate is the biggest threat. It's actually taken away their ability to revolt and to, in fact, be dynamic. Because what they're hearing is Larry Fink's on your side, President Biden, all these septuagenarians who are on your side. And it kind of takes away a motive for change and dynamism.
I haven't thought of it in those terms, and I think you state it very well. Well, one of the other things that I have just a couple more questions for you, because we've been going on for more than an hour now, and my guest is Rupert Darwall. He's a senior fellow at the RealClearFoundation. He's the author of a new report called Capitalism, Socialism, and ESG, as well as two other books, Green Tyranny and The Age of Global Warming. I haven't read Age of Global Warming, but Green Tyranny it really does address some of the issues that I've thought about, but haven't wish I'd written parts of what he's got in that book. What's the hardest part of your job, though? I mean, it's a question I like to ask of people in all kinds of different professions, and I think about it myself and what I do, and we are on somewhat similar tracks here as in the journalism, the lowly business of writing about the world. What's the hardest part of that for you?
I think, well, I wouldn't say the hardest part, but the thing that I miss the most is interacting with people. And that's particularly the case with lockdowns and pandemics, particularly in the UK.
It's been dreadful. It's just been
And
dreadful.
I think isolation is, in a way, the hardest thing about, you have to be isolated. It involves, you have to be alone to write. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be alone. I thrive on interaction with people, and I see myself in a way in the ecosystem, as it were, as like a sponge on the seabed. I try and get, the bits that are floating by and picking them up. And so I think it's really, I think being able to meet, the thing that I'm not doing enough of at the moment is seeing people and meeting people and talking, and because that's also how new ideas come, and you see things in a slightly different way. I think that's absolutely essential.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And well, in the last couple of weeks, I've had some in-person events, and I was thank God. I mean, for a live audience and people, and you just talk about, well, what about your business? Tell me about your business. And just that you learn.
There's no substitute.
You learn by just that proximity, and you learn from the body language, and you learn from, the things they say, they don't say, so on. So last question, Rupert, we've talked a lot about freedom and liberty, and we've kind of taken for granted, or kind of the unspoken part of what we've discussed is the absolute essentiality of energy and power for betterment of people, right? Which Alex Epstein, I know you've been on his podcast, and he makes that case very well. What gives you hope?
Knowledge is power. That was Francis Bacon in the 17th century, but knowledge is power. And that, so ultimately, that's the business we're in, isn't it?
It's interesting that you mentioned Bacon. I need to look him up. I'm not familiar with his work, but that's great. Yeah, knowledge is power. There's a great podcast, and I'm a great fan of Jordan Peterson, and he had a Canadian journalist, maybe you're familiar with him, on his podcast named Rex Murphy. And he talked about Francis Bacon, that he thought Francis Bacon's writing was some of the best he's ever read in his entire career, which I thought was really quite interesting. But I agree. Knowledge is power. And that's one of the things that gives me hope as well, is that, as Jessica Mitford, the great, well, she was a Brit. You're familiar with the Mitford sisters. She said, you may not be able to change the world. Hello.
Oh, that's our puppy going off.
Mitford famously said, you may not be able to change the world, but at least you can embarrass the guilty. So that's what.
That's very good. That's very good.
Well, Rupert, let's cut it off there. Unless you have something else to add, I'll stop the recording here. Thank you very much. My guest has been Rupert Darwall. He's a senior fellow at the RealClearFoundation. Thanks to all of you. You can find his work. His new report on climate, socialism, and ESG is on the RealClearFoundation website, Real Clear Politics, Real Clear Energy. Thank you, Rupert, and thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in next time for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Until then.